What I wanted to talk about today is, so to say, how we set up our gaming business when we started a couple of years ago. And obviously, for us, it was important that we set up a company that is kind of like stable. And what do I mean by that? I will get into in a second. So basically, when we started, we saw a lot of this happening in the market. I call it shark finning. It's basically that a game gets pushed into the market, it gets a lot of marketing money thrown at it, the user numbers will go up. Let me see, so that is this, those are the user numbers or any KPIs. And then after a certain while, the people from that team are shifted over to a new project, marketing is stopped or reduced gradually, and then the game will eventually die off and be sunset. So basically we saw that happening a lot in the market, and hold on. All right, okay, so exactly, so something was started from scratch, and then the people were put onto that game. And what happened then is actually, if you do this shark finning and you have a game that goes up and then it drops down, you are bound to, so to say, make sure that the next game that you do will be even more successful, because now the whole team has moved over, nobody's working on the old title anymore, and then everything that you have in your company, so say all your eggs, are in the next basket. So then what happens if that game is perhaps delayed a little bit, or it didn't do as well as you had originally planned for, then the studio is in big problems. And actually this is something that in the last years that we have been around, we've seen happening a lot of times with some of the people that started at the same time as we did. So we did not want that to happen to us. Obviously, because I like to be in gaming. I don't know if somebody else will hire me, so I better make sure that my company actually still stays around for a little bit longer. So we thought about doing something slightly different, and we call that, so to say, evergreen titles. So basically, we look at the market and we see that there are certain genres and mechanisms in the gaming world that have basically been around forever. One of them is probably like match 3. That has been around. Today, everything that you play with match 3 is something with candy or cookie or something. A couple of years back, it was all called something with Bejeweled, but fundamentally the concept of match 3 has been around, and I bet it will be around in the next 10 years, then perhaps with virtual reality glasses, but it will still be some form of match 3. So we decided that the games we do should have, so to say, an evergreen potential. Basically, games that will continue to live as long as we feed them, and not just for a couple of months or perhaps 1 or 2 years. So we have chosen titles like Solitaire, for example. You know, on the old Windows computers, you were already playing Solitaire. People play Solitaire today. People will probably continue to play some form of Solitaire going forward. So what does it allow us to do with evergreen titles? So here is, for one of our first games, Mahjong Trails, I've just jotted down to say the revenues for that game over the last couple of quarters, starting in 2012 actually. And what you can see is that unlike that shark fin you saw in the beginning, this is actually something that continues to grow. And with this game, almost every single quarter that we had since the game was launched has been a record quarter for that game. And you can imagine that by now, obviously, so say, the development cost that went into this game in the beginning, now we have made that back plentyfold, and this game has turned into a very good cash cow for us, and it continues to be for us. Here is, so say, another chart, revenues per user in the game. You can also see that that is going up, and things like DAU to MAU ratio also continuing to going up. So you can see 30% of the monthly active users actually play on any given day in that game. So this is a game that has been around for quite a long time, and that is kind of like for us a fundamental, to say, key to being an evergreen title. So obviously when we talk to some people out there, there are a couple of questions, and I try to sum up some of them here. What happens to the teams on those games? So obviously if a game has been in production or development for 5 years, does that mean that the same team is still doing that? Most of the time not. Because I think after a certain while, some people would like to do something else. They would like to work on a new game, and then we facilitate that. Also, I think the skills that are required in the beginning are slightly different to a later stage in the game, where it's actually then more about numbers, business intelligence, and kind of like grinding the game. But what is important is that the people working on that game still consider this to be, so to say, an important project in the company, and not kind of like, yeah, that's that old game. Or the other guys, they get to work on the cool new game, and I'm stuck here in the old one. So this is not what is supposed to happen. It's actually more the other way around, that everybody else in the studio is really appreciating the work that those guys are doing, because effectively they are financing everything else that we're doing. Another question that we get sometimes is about the size of the teams. So also that stays roughly the same. In general, our teams are not very big, so we tend to have teams 5 to 10 people per game that we're working on. So try to really, so to say, have tightly knit teams. So I told you about the evergreen titles that we're looking at. Something else that we then looked at that has, so to say, evergreen potential, that is TV. So we launched a game that is called Suburbia. So these are some of the numbers for Suburbia 1. And basically, Suburbia is something where we looked at, okay, so there are certain games that are played over a longer time, and if you continue to feed them, people will play them. Another thing that happens for a long time is TV series. There's some TV series that go on for season after season. There's just new content being launched. And we thought, this is actually something that we know how to do. We know how to do something that continues for a long time, where you continue to add content and keep people in the game. So we basically came up with Suburbia, which is now, so to say, our second franchise, and we did the core of it makes basically like a Sims game, a live simulation game, and then we have episodes on top of that. We have seasons, and we build kind of like a game that behaves like a TV series. And ideally, also that will go on for years. Kind of like Friends or Days of Our Lives, series like that. So, and that is then, so to say, the thing that we're doing in our 2 franchises. So this is the one that kind of like behaves a little bit also like the King games and others out there, where you have a progression path. So we have evergreen titles, and then we group them into franchises, where we basically have games that behave in the same way. And here you see Mahjong was our first game in that franchise. Then we did a Solitaire. I said earlier on, we believe that those 2 genres are some genres that are generally played for a long time. And then we recently launched Solitaire Chronicles, which is kind of like a sequel to Solitaire Castle. Likewise, in the Suburbia franchise, I just talked about the game, and you can obviously see that also there, you can kind of like extend that into other settings, yeah, so you could have in Hawaii, you could have a little Italy, that is a little bit, I don't know, like The Sopranos or Bronx, something like that. So you can kind of like extend those titles into franchises. Why would you do that? Basically, the idea is that when we go into new titles, we want to make sure that we can actually reuse a lot of the stuff that we have done so far. I don't know if you can actually read this. Sorry for that, it's probably the template. But it's basically, so here's the Trails franchise, here's the Suburbia franchise, and then we have the games on top of that. And the idea is that we are using a lot of the code that we have written once for any of those games, and then when we do a new game, we can reuse that and effectively drive down the development cost of a new title. And then, because most of those games are addressing the same demographics, they're on the same platform, so why replicate all the code again when you do a new game? So, again, a couple of questions that we are getting when we talk about evergreen franchises. The question, so say, all the eggs in one basket for tech, art, and genre. And actually, yeah, to some extent it is, but I think it actually, so to say, is something that helps us. Because, as I said, it drives down the cost of a new game. And over the time in our franchises, we have had games that we launched that perhaps did not do as well as we had originally planned. And what then did not happen was exactly what I described early on, that perhaps the studio went bust because we had one title that didn't do well. We were actually able to then to say, okay, this didn't work, and continue, we again to say, continue working with the code and bring out a new game. How do you react to changes in the market, new trends, game loops, and so on? So this is actually something that I want to make clear that just so that you understand there is no confusion around that. So it doesn't mean that the games, even though they have been in the market for 5 years, stay the same for 5 years. We actually work on them a lot. So we actually change the game loops if we feel they should be changed. We're changing some of the mechanisms in the game. We're changing, so to say, the goals, the missions, some of the content, the UI. We constantly do that. So with that, we are actually reacting to the changes in the market, but we do it on the games that are out there. So for example, if UI changes, and I don't know, all the big games have suddenly completely different payment windows, and the users are used to that, then we will probably go with a similar payment window in our games as well. Last question that we're getting sometimes is, if you have, so to say, regional differences with a common code, so if everything in the game is, so to say, very common and it's the same across the whole game, how are you able to adapt to regional things? And we actually do that. So we do have things in the games like Thanksgiving for the US player base, we have Christmas, we have stuff like that in the game, and we can actually do that by either having, so to say, different groups in the games, so basically running a couple of weeks of an A/B situation in the game, but we can also have it live for everything else. So we are using what we can to also adapt to regional differences in the market. So now I've talked about evergreen titles, I've talked about, so to say, evergreen franchises, grouping all that into so to say, groups that can learn and help each other. So what happens if we choose a new title? How do we do it? So basically, as I said, we're looking for something that has an evergreen potential. Something that we feel is not a, so to say, quick thing like Flappy Birds. So obviously that was popular, but we knew it's probably not going to be popular for the next 5 years. So this is not something we're going after. Evergreen potential. Then, exactly, so that's what I said. And then what we do is we look at all the risks associated with launching a new title. So normally if you launch a new title, you put together a team that has not worked together in that constellation before. You're going after a genre or, so to say, certain game design elements that you probably haven't done before. You might be going after different demographics, different technology, platform. This industry is evolving so quickly, so there might always be something new. What we're trying to do is, when we do a new game, is not to change all that at once. We do like to innovate, but then we would try to do it only for certain parts. For example, I told you earlier we had a game called Solitaire Castle, and now we recently launched Solitaire Chronicles. Why did we go for a second Solitaire game? Basically because Solitaire Castle was a Facebook-only game, and we said, okay, now we want to go into mobile, we want to expand, we want to do cross-platform. So it was a different platform. We knew, because the old game was developed in Flash, we knew we had to go for a different technology. We used Starling for that, so different technology. We had a slightly different team, obviously because the technology was different. So then we basically already had 2.5 of those that were new. And then we said, okay, so 2.5 risks are around, let's keep all the other things roughly the same. Let's take a game where we know how it works, the game design, where we do have the demographics, we can cross-promote to the users, we can actually talk to the users beforehand, see what they liked about the first one, what they would like to have in the second one, and then build it around that. And with that, again, de-risking new title development going forward. So, quickly summing up the takeaways for this, what we do, obviously, you don't have to do it like that, but that's kind of like how we have been doing it for the 7 years that we've been around, and for us, it has actually been very helpful. So, looking at long tail, yes? So, looking at games that you can run for years and years and years, because you can then make a lot of money with that game over the years. Stay close to home when you go for new games. Don't risk everything. I know it's tempting to do new cool stuff, and people in the team might say, okay, let's try this, let's try that, but try to de-risk it. Then, when you have a great game, try to build a franchise around it so that you can cross-promote from one game to another. Build technology that is reusable across many games, so you don't have to start from scratch all over again when you do a new title, so you can quickly get into the market and test if that game is actually any good, and then repeat from top.
Great, thank you so much. Thank you. Okay, just one quick question for myself is, how many new games are you putting out on a yearly basis?
So at the moment, roughly 2 to 3.
Great. Is there any questions from the audience?
How do you manage different features that you may release in one game but don't release in another game across your entire platform?
So normally we would, if there's something new that we feel strongly about, then we would normally test it in one game, and then if it works there, that code would kind of like go into the library, and then all the other games can access that. They don't have to, yeah. So if they think that that feature doesn't make sense for them, they don't have to use it. But it's kind of like a modular approach. You can say, okay, that I take into my game, so the producer can decide that, and then it's basically just integrating that code, yes or not.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. How do you deal with competition in very saturated market, let's say the Match 3 or even the Sims? So how do you deal with big competitors like King?
Yeah, so actually in so Match 3, although that is a great evergreen genre, so there we have not got into that because I think that is right now very crowded. But I think there are others. For the simulation part, actually, there it worked quite nicely for us because we actually still had Suburbia in soft launch, and then some people from the Sims worldwide community somehow discovered that game and just went crazy. I've actually never seen anything like that. So they basically just bombarded us and said, okay, we need to play this game. So there it actually, as I say, worked. And yeah, some of those other gaming companies are much bigger. So I think back in the days when SimSocial, I think the team that then actually launched SimSocial was 200 people. We were like 10 people. So we were actually still, so to say, faster. And obviously, if you don't have such a huge overhead, again, you can stay on longer because SimSocial was eventually shut down because there was just no way that that game would be sustainable for a 200 people team. So again, there, kind of like the long tail is the one that then did the trick for us.
Right, one more question for myself is I noticed the revenues in the Mahjong game really increased year by year. And actually from 2012, it looked like to 2015, almost like triple or quadruple the revenue. How do you explain that?
So again, so I think it's very much, so to say, continuing to work on the game, making sure that all the stuff that we learn from the game, we continue to improve it, but also incorporating stuff that we then see in the other games that are working and putting it in there. But really, I think making sure that there's still big focus on those titles, although they are, so to say, old and perhaps, so to say, perceived then as not as sexy, but continue to work on them, because what will happen if you lose mind share of them, then they will slip. That is inevitable. So we had those situations with, oh, well, now it's slipping, let's put some focus on it again, and then we managed to turn around. Keep the focus there if you want that to happen. Obviously, if you have a different strategy, doesn't matter, but otherwise, keep it like that, yeah.
Any other questions? Okay, Henning, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Again for Henning.